As a teenager, I met some communists. They convinced me that communism was good. And so for 2 years, I was part of their movement. So I connected communist literature, and I saw the difference between what they were saying in the 1940s and what they said earlier. I would be reading things, and I would say, this is wrong. This is not what they told us last year. This is not what they wrote about in the 1930s. By the time I was 18, I knew that they were wrong. And after that, I spent most of my time working on anti-communist activities. And people would ask me, do you hate the communists? I said, I hate communism, but I don't hate communists because they taught me to read the most boring literature in the world. And they did me a favor teaching me to read this nonsense because now I understood how bad they were and I could educate other people on how bad they were.
Comrades, I was lucky enough to spend a few months in Soviet Russia, and I can assure you that the Russian Revolution has proved a success. The Russian working class has made a considerable breach in the wall of international capitalism. The exploiters will never manage to seal it off. It will keep widening until the great proletarian wave finally floods the capitalist class all over the world.
The communist cadre in the United States was following changes in the Soviet line as transmitted through its various instruments. One of them, of course, was the Daily Worker, the newspaper published here in the United States, which is a remarkable laboratory for studying the changes in the party line.
The Communist Party was not an independent American group, but it was completely controlled by the Soviet Union. It was involved in recruiting Americans to spy on America.
Well, there was a climate within, on the left side of the political spectrum in the United States, which had some sympathy for socialism and maybe even for Soviet-style communism because of the problems of the Great Depression.
The spectacular stock market crash in the fall of 1929, while in fact resulting from an exponential increase in state intervention since the First World War, paradoxically makes socialist concepts more attractive to a growing number of people, convinced that economic freedom has failed to deliver. The fact that establishing socialist rule in Russia had already cost millions of human lives is not commonly acknowledged.
In the 30s, when there was a big economic crisis in the West, people became more interested in how they could learn from Soviet examples. And this was an era when Western intellectuals went to the Soviet Union and tried to learn how they too could achieve such rapid industrialization and success.
The Soviets knew how to spread propaganda and disinformation. They would invite prominent, widely respected individuals from the West, writers for example, and give them a tour of Russia. The entire deception operation relied on Western, mostly American liberals, who kept saying that all the news from Soviet Russia of alleged mass murders, concentration camps, or famine in the Ukraine was not corroborated by hard facts. They simply refused to believe that such things were even possible. The Soviets placed a lot of emphasis on spreading the kind of ideology that was potentially acceptable to the West, kind of liberal leftist ideology. Not hardcore communist ideology, unacceptable to the average middle-of-the-road American, but rather a socialist one.
Generally speaking, over the course of the Soviet Union's life, Western interest in the camps and in Soviet terror in general tended to reflect Western politics.
President Roosevelt himself and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, had leftist socialist leanings.
Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, was playing around with the communists. They were her friends.
The American State Department is, by and large, swayed by Soviet propaganda, which argues that Soviet Russia is a rapidly developing country with a fast-growing economy that may have had its ups and downs, but in general human rights are respected there. And they cite the Soviet Constitution, which guarantees personal freedom and freedom of speech to everyone.
So you had people who actually believed in all of this. And then, of course, there were the spies, and there were many of them.
The Bolsheviks started infiltrating and sending spies to the U.S. very early on in the 1920s. The most effective intelligence operation, to my way of thinking, was the early Russian spies, mostly Jews, working in the United States using American Jews as a natural ally.
In the case of Yitzhak Akhmerov, who was the illegal resident in the United States, they got him a passport in 1934 by the name of Bill Grinke. And this was somebody who had died as a child, but his family had his papers, and they were able to use that to go into the passport office and get a U.S. passport for Akhmerov. And Akhmerov married an American girl who was the niece of the head of the Communist Party. He gave up his Russian wife and he married her. And she had some children by him. And her children and his children by the previous marriage all went to work for KGB after the war. And Akhmerov as illegal resident. He met some of the agents himself because they were so sensitive that they couldn't be seen to be in contact with the other NKVD officers of the Soviet embassy. And Akhmerov had a contact at the embassy who would come to him regularly and receive copies of the messages he wanted to send to Moscow, of course in code.
A number of so-called illegals, that is, agents with assumed identities, set up intelligence networks on United States territory. The entire Soviet spy ring in the West sought not only to influence political decisions, but also to achieve practical economic goals. That is, first and foremost, the appropriation of patents. Hundreds of NKVD and GRU agents, some of whom are highly qualified engineers and scientists, smuggled thousands of pages of blueprints, drawings of high-tech equipment, plans of entire production lines, and even ready-made copies and samples of the new technological solutions out of the United States. The United States played an important role for the Soviet Union because of technology. In 1930, a tank production line was bought in the United States. Well, actually, it was a tractor production line, but it amounts to the same thing. The Soviets, though, had to pay cash because the Americans initially would not extend loans to them. It was strictly business. America is our friend. She's built for us the biggest armor, artillery, and warplane factories in the Soviet Union. We have a lot of gold. There are the Kolyma gold fields, but someone has to work there. So they arrest the Trotskyites, send them to Kolyma's mines, and now they can dig the gold for us for free. The gold goes to America, and in return, American engineers arrive to install machine tools, and we're left with another gulag where people are erecting walls. They're erecting walls following American designs, and then Americans set up machine shops within those walls. There was, for instance, a well-known tractor factory in Kharkov, a famous place shown in many movies. And there was an assembly room for tanks there, which was never shown to anyone, even though its area was bigger than the rest of the factory premises put together. They bought a prototype and copied it, and that's how the T-34 was developed for 10 years. T-34 tanks were basically modeled on the American Christie. The Christie prototype, though, was bought as if for personal use, like you'd buy a car. The point is this: would it have made any sense? All those efforts, resources, years spent on war preparations, if they hadn't been actually preparing an attack? Especially given the concept of world revolution.
Avanti popolo, alla risposta, bandiera rossa.
Lenin predicted that the global revolution would develop all the faster and more permanently, depending on how effective the help offered to the working classes of all the other countries by the first socialist country will have been.
Du Sturmsignal, blutrote Fahne, aus Leid und Qual.
At one point during the 1920s, during a meeting of the Comintern, the Executive Committee of Communist International, Karol Radek made a proposal that communists and Nazis should cooperate, encouraging German communists to collaborate with the NSDAP. And for a short period of time, there was indeed cooperation. After all, National Socialism is socialism. It was a workers' party, so the alliance is kind of natural, its ultimate aim being to liquidate all capitalist states. After all, entire units of the Communist Party joined the NSDAP, taking their banners with them. People saw no difference between the communists and the Nazis. Even the symbolism was the same. The flags were red. There were joint meetings, joint declarations. Later on, all that was hushed up, of course.
Freiheit und Frieden, wir werden bald.
The tactic depended on making the most of the differences between two groups of capitalist countries, playing one off against the other. Following Lenin's advice, the Soviets consistently supported the First World War's greatest loser, Germany. Circumventing the bans of the Versailles Treaty, the Reichswehr practiced on secret training grounds in the Soviet Union. The course of history is irreversibly determined by another decision of Stalin, forbidding the German communists to form a coalition with Social Democrats, enabling Hitler's National Socialist Party, which otherwise would have remained a minority force, to form a government. Stalin paved the way for a power takeover by Hitler. Hitler came to power on January 30th, 1933. Exactly 1 week later, the Soviet Union announced a plan to ensure the collective security of Europe. Immediately, the Soviet diplomats began urging various states to join forces against Hitler.
Then the party line changed, and all the communists immediately had to adopt a new line, which was that the socialists and the social democrats were now all fraternal collaborators in the common front against Nazism and fascism.
Many communists in the United States joined in the 1930s because the slogan was anti-Nazi. You're joining the Communist Party because they're the hardest fighters against Nazism.
The Civil War broke out in Spain. and Stalin immediately dispatched thousands of military advisors, intelligence agents, generals, tank crews, pilots, all of them to fight over there. And Stalin said to Great Britain and France, said, there are children dying out there. You must intervene. But Great Britain and France did not intervene. So the Second World War did not break out in Spain. That much had become clear by March 1939. Stalin understood that the war could not be started there. So after 3 months, he dismissed Litvinov because he was Jewish and thus unsuitable for talks with Hitler, appointed Molotov instead, and said, if we can't start the war there, we'll start it here, in Poland. The Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939 is usually viewed as an act of political partition, but the key, however, was the economic agreement signed 2 or 3 days previously. It is the August 19th agreement which forged the energetic alliance, because the Soviets started providing the Germans with gasoline and strategic raw materials indispensable for war on a large scale. Of course, we can't tell what would have happened later, but we know for sure that without these economic and political agreements, Hitler would not have ordered the attack on Poland on the 1st of September 1939. These are not speculations. This has been corroborated by documents. There is a written instruction that if the order to attack is not issued on the 1st of September, or if it is rescinded, then the whole operation is cancelled for the year, which means there would have been no war in 1939. On September 1st, 1939, hardly anyone realized that a new world war had just begun. The only capital in which that much seemed obvious was Moscow. Great days are coming, declared Soviet illegal Akhmerov during a secret meeting with one of his American agents. The outbreak of a world war means that the revolution is going to spread across the West like wildfire. In January 1940, Stalin told his trusted associates, "World revolution as a single act is a nonsense. It follows different schedules in different countries." Soviet Minister Molotov informed the Lithuanians, who had just lost their independence, small countries are bound to disappear. So you should immediately start making your nation compatible with the Soviet system, which is going to rule over all of Europe. On the conquered territories of Poland, Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Romania, the Soviets arrested, deported, and murdered hundreds of thousands of people. But for decades to come, the propagandist myth of Soviet neutrality and unpreparedness for the war would prevail. From their perspective, in 1939 and 1940, all went according to plan. What had not been planned was the quick pace of German victories. That was news to them. They had counted on a repetition of the First World War, with prolonged military operations which would bleed and wear out the warring parties, eventually paving the way for the export of revolution. Needless to say, it would not be a peaceful export. In the 1990s, when the archives were unsealed, it became clear that the Soviet General Staff had devised elaborate plans for the confrontation with Germany. Between 1939 and 1941, at least 5 variations of war with Germany were considered. The first 3, those that we know about, because there may have been more, presupposed the launch of a major offensive into the territories of East Prussia and a support offensive into central Poland. The Soviet Union was preparing for war. The Western Front, 500,000 people, more tanks than in all of Germany, in only one Western military district. and the quality of tanks was considerably higher. There were 1,400 T-34s. No other army in the world possessed anything even close, let alone comparable to these tanks. The same held true for aircraft. With the Soviet Air Force outnumbering the German forces by 4 or 5 to 1, one can hardly talk about German air supremacy. Stalin had 5 airborne corps. No one else had such units. The Germans had half a corps and a few battalions, while we had 5 airborne corps plus 5 more in the process of formation. And obviously they were not needed for self-defense. Another liberating march of the Red Army into Moldavia in the summer of 1940, with the Soviet Air Armada launching the largest airborne landing before D-Day, raised justified concerns on Hitler's part. The Soviet tanks were only a day's drive from the Romanian oil fields in Ploiești. Imagine we had dropped paratroopers in Romania, where there were few German forces and where all the oil came from. All you needed to do was to drop some paratroopers with matches and everything goes up in flames. We don't need that oil. We've got plenty of our own, so we can just put a match to it. And further down the road there's Yugoslavia, then Greece. They need liberating too. And then it's Iran and China. No one can stop us. Berlin, Hamburg, and in Paris they'll greet us with flowers. We're liberators after all, liberators. On the 5th of May 1941, Stalin addressed the graduates of military academies at the Kremlin. A policy of peace is a good thing up to a point. Now that our army has been reorganized, now that it has been generously equipped with state-of-the-art weapons indispensable for modern warfare, now that we are stronger, the time has come to launch an offensive. Significantly, the 4th version of the war scenario had a date in it. Launch an offensive on June the 15th, 1941. However, the Soviet war machine was inherently inert, so they had to reschedule the assault date somewhat. But what is important is that the Soviet army's concentration was carried out in accordance with that plan for an all-out attack. We were all set, but Hitler foiled our plans. It is not possible to be prepared equally well for assault and defense. Preparing for an attack makes you vulnerable. In 1941, Germans would capture 3.5 million prisoners of war out of the 5.5 million man Red Army, while 700,000 would desert. On Soviet territory, Germans were in many places greeted with flowers. All in all, around 1 million Soviet citizens would join Hitler's army or its auxiliary units. It began to dawn on Stalin that his empire was collapsing, and everything for the sake of which he'd destroyed millions or even tens of millions of human lives might just go to waste. When the Politburo, practically the entire gang, showed up one day in his office, at that moment, according to Molotov and Marenkov, he got scared. He thought he'd be arrested and brought to justice for losing the war, but all they wanted was for him to take charge again. Because they knew that within the system that he'd built, only he could rule effectively. So Stalin again took the lead and made the famous speech that starts with, "Dear brothers and sisters." When things had gone wrong, he suddenly remembered about his brothers and his sisters. The army had disintegrated. No one wanted to fight for Stalin's collective farms, so he implemented radical reforms once again. He reopened the Orthodox churches, reintroduced shoulder marks into the military. Shoulder marks signified a white army uniform. He talked about Russian nationalism. Once the direct threat to the Soviet regime had gone, the terror against the clergy and the religious returned. Meanwhile, however, Stalin met Orthodox Metropolitan Sergei officially at the Kremlin, while Radio Moscow started broadcasting morning church services. Stalin would resort to the Mother Russia slogan, to the patriotism personified by the great Tsars from the past. That was another flexible turn on his part, enabling him to control the situation again. Indeed, the Soviets' ingenuity on that front knew no bounds.
The Soviets decided that they needed to have support from Jews around the world. So they set up a Jewish anti-fascist committee, and they took 2 Polish Jews out of the concentration camp to be the leaders of this. They were Heinrich Erich and Victor Alter, who had been leaders of the Polish Bund, Socialist Bund, before the war. After a few months with them, the NKVD decided that they didn't want them anymore, so they took them out and they shot them. And they put in, at this point, some Soviet Jews as leaders. And eventually, after the war, they shot them too. But in the meantime, during the war, they used them.
Ultimately, the Soviet regime would be saved by German atrocities and the socialist doctrine of Nazi authorities, who did not close the collective farms on conquered territories to give the land back to the peasants. For the time being, however, the Kremlin did not rule out the possibility of a separatist armistice with Germany. In February 1942, at the instigation and initiative of Stalin himself, Soviet-German talks began, although not through diplomatic channels, but through the Secret Service. The talks were held at a place called Nicejsk, on the German side of the front, and they were between Beria's deputy Merkulov and an SS general named Wolf, who was chief of Heinrich Himmler's personal staff. According to a written instruction that was seen by Karpov and he included in his book, Stalin declared that he would join the fight against Zionism. Stalin undertook an obligation to join in the war against the United States and Great Britain, of course standing alongside the German armed forces. Ultimately, the Merkulov-Wolf Pact was never implemented. Such measures proved unnecessary as the West's entire public opinion unconditionally supported the Soviet Union. The West concluded that Stalin should be given full support, thus taking the side of one mass murderer in his fight against another mass murderer.
The Soviet government was taking all this Lend-Lease. As a matter of fact, most of the important weapons that the Red Army had by 1943-44 were American-made weapons.
The Soviets willingly accepted assistance, although their internal propaganda machine tried to diminish the scale. Some simple Soviet soldiers believed that the letters USA on their tanks stood for "undoing that son of a bitch Adolf" in Russian. To make the new propagandist line more credible for the West, Stalin went as far as to abolish the Comintern, the forge of the world revolution forces.
And the American communists were extraordinarily disciplined.
Very, very, very few Communist Party members left the party during the pact.
The main deception operation on the Soviets' part focused on picturing Soviet Russia as Hitler's victim, or the victim of the Second World War, thus eliminating the question of Soviet responsibility for the partition of Poland, for the outbreak of the Second World War. The first victim of this deception is, of course, Poland.
There was constant propaganda in the United States to undermine the image of Poland because of the American communists, following what the Soviets wanted, did not want that to be an independent Poland.
The Red Army offensive was in full swing, the Germans in retreat, and at this point, the Katyn question emerged. And this was Stalin's biggest accomplishment, for it becomes apparent that even such an issue as the Katyn massacre cannot change the West's attitude towards the Soviet Union.
Katyn was not something that the American people understood, because the American government was saying that the Germans did it. And the American government was concealing the information that it was a Soviet secret police that did the murders.
Once they regained the strategic initiative on the front, the Soviets started ethnic cleansing in their own territory, deporting Greeks, Bulgarians, Crimean Armenians, Meskhetian Turks, and Caucasus Kurds suspected of disloyalty. Altogether some 3 million people, out of which at least 1/4 would not survive the deportation. Meanwhile, the Germans satisfied the most urgent need of Soviet propaganda, the demand for absolute evil, in whose face nobody will ask about the Gulag or Katyn. The Stalin scene on the covers of Western magazines is an appropriate symbol of how the West in general, and the United States in particular, had been anesthetized to problems related to anything Soviet or communist. For Western intellectual circles, for Western poets, for the West's public opinion in general, Stalin seemed a providential figure, a godsend.
Stalin was an ally of the West, so between 1941 and 1945, when there was an enormous effort to, literally turning a blind eye to what was going on in the Soviet Union and in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe in order to maintain the alliance with Stalin in order to defeat Hitler. And this had a kind of long after effect.
Only after the war would Western secret service agencies be able to assess the scope of Soviet infiltration. For the time being, however, several hundred NKVD and GRU agents planted in the American military and administration were busy doing their jobs unhindered by any major obstacles. Stalin's informers were not only resident agents in New York City or Washington, D.C., not only communist activists or networks of the Communist Party USA. The underground world of communism also had some excellent sources of information in the Department of State, in circles close to President Roosevelt at its disposal.
Akhmerov was a very talented officer. He had this Bill Grinke identity. What he was supposed to be was a furrier. He made fur coats and sold them. And you could raise the question of why Harry Hopkins, a very important U.S. government official, was meeting with him. Because was he going just to buy a fur coat from this man? He was meeting with him, of course, because Hopkins was an agent. Harry Hopkins, the president's closest friend, he was living at the White House. How we know that Hopkins was an agent. Hopkins had always been considered a rather left-wing influence on Roosevelt, but nobody thought that it was possible he was actually a Soviet agent. But then some messages in Venona were broken, and one message said that Agent 19 has met with Roosevelt and Churchill and reported on the conversation about the plans for D-Day. And they found that there was only one such meeting of Roosevelt and Churchill with one other person present, Harry Hopkins.
Only one of two things are possible. One is that Roosevelt had to be completely ignorant about the nature of the Soviet Union, the character of its government, the character of its ideology, and that he might have been deceived by people like Harry Hopkins, or Roosevelt might have been sympathetic to the Soviet enterprise.
In May 1944, US Vice President Henry Wallace visited one of the Siberian gold mining centers, the forced labor camp at Magadan in Kolyma. The Gulag's managers made sure that he formed favorable impressions from the trip. The American statesman had no idea that he had just toured the Soviet Auschwitz. The New York Times printed ads for Soviet gold war bonds. Moscow used them to partly pay for American supplies. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau declared that the United States authorities were not interested in Soviet gold mining methods.
And Churchill, who knew better, sometimes he was not, but on Poland, Churchill was a little better. And he was sending messages to Roosevelt during the Warsaw Uprising that it was necessary to send planes with supplies to help the people in Warsaw. Harry Hopkins was talking to an Air Force officer about this and said, "Don't worry, you're not going to have to fly to Warsaw because I'm going to hold back the messages from Churchill so Roosevelt won't see them until I can figure out a good answer to give to Churchill about why we should not help the Poles."
The Soviet government permitted only one airdrop and protested any further airdrops to the United States, and the United States essentially went along with the Soviet requests.
Roosevelt was very, very ill, and he took the advice of the people who were around him. Hopkins was very important in that.
At Yalta, Admiral Leahy, who was President Roosevelt's military advisor, said to Roosevelt, "You know, Mr. President, the Soviets can take this agreement and stretch it all the way from here in Yalta to Washington and back without ever technically breaking it." And Roosevelt said to him, "I know, Bill, I know, but it's the best I can do."
Well, I mean, we know what happened. The American government sold out Poland and allowed it to become a Soviet satellite.
Волей польского народа на освобожденной польской земле создан Комитет национального освобождения. Красная армия продолжает победный путь на запад.
During its westward march, the Red Army routinely engaged in looting and rape. In the conquered countries, the NKVD engaged in bloody confrontations with local patriots.
The NKVD did use the remains of German camps in Poland. Auschwitz, Majdanek, and other camps weren't used to hold temporarily members of the opposition or of the Home Army or whoever the NKVD and the Red Army wanted to get rid of. Stalin exported the idea of the Gulag into every country that he occupied.
Stalin looted the whole of Central and Eastern Europe, including Germany, divesting it of factories, industrial machinery, infrastructure. Something like 99% of it was simply taken away to the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Hungarians, Romanians, and other Central Europeans died in the course of executions and deportations. It is worth repeating the opinion of John Hartford McIntyre. Who rules Eastern Europe, that is Poland, and the neighboring countries located in the Intermarum region, lying between the Baltic, the Adriatic, and the Black Seas? Or, in other words, who rules Eastern Europe rules the heartland, or the interior of Eurasia. Who rules the heartland rules the island of the world, or the three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Who rules the island of the world rules the world. And after the Second World War, Stalin immediately started preparations for World War III. It was like this. The Red Army was ready to keep marching. After all, some columns had even got as far as the Rhineland and had had to pull back. What prevented the outbreak of World War III at this point was the Americans' acquisition of the atom bomb. At that point, the option of not stopping at the Elbe but continuing all the way to the Atlantic was no longer an option. Thanks to the bomb. Even though the Soviets had already managed to steal the nuclear secrets of the Manhattan Project, thanks to, among other things, Harry Hopkins' personal involvement, and had even received some nuclear fission materials from American sources, it would take a few years before they managed to come up with their own bomb and the means of transporting it. Meanwhile, the defection of GRU cipher clerk Guzenko from the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, Elizabeth Bentley's desertion from the NKVD spy ring in America, and, most importantly, the successful cracking of Soviet ciphers as a result of Operation Venona, alerted Western leaders to the scale of communist infiltration. The West began to resist the Soviets' aggressive plans in a more consistent manner. In 1946, the Red Army pulled out of Iran solely because of the Americans' possession of the atom bomb. The Second World War resulted in only part of Germany being obtained, and not the best part at that. They're very angry. Stalin allegedly considered stepping down at one point. Everyone said so in their memoirs, that he kept saying, "I quit, I give up. I'm an old man. I didn't do what should have been done. I should have taken everything, all of Europe, because it's the basis for world revolution." In the years 1946 to 1947, some 2 million Soviet citizens would die of hunger. Against this background, it is hard to conduct a world revolution. So the Second World War was over. The Americans had the atom bomb, and we didn't. The Americans had an ocean-going fleet, and we didn't. The Americans had strategic aircraft, B-17, B-20, we didn't. In addition, Americans had plenty of food, and we were starving. 27 million men were killed, so our armed forces had a manpower problem, and a struggle for peace began. The Soviets started an extensive disinformation campaign in which the useful idiots from the West proved invaluable once more. The illustrious painter Picasso with Ceylonese architect de Silva and American sculptor Davidson, Julian Bender, a French philosopher, famous Soviet writer Ilya Ehrenberg, the French priest Jean Boulier. The desire for peace of the largest possible number of nations, or at least those with a decisive voice at a given historical moment, should force the relatively few who do not want peace to silence. Communists always fight for peace. It's their innate characteristic. The point is for us to live in peace and to let them conquer us. Stalin never slackened the pace of war preparation. He never reduced investments in the military sector. On the contrary, he increased them. The Comintern was soon reactivated by Stalin under the new label of Cominform, providing funds for communist sabotage throughout the West. Rebuilding and modernizing the Red Army, however, would take several years. Meanwhile, in conquered Central Europe, Stalin repeated the same cycle of war preparations he'd gone through before he provoked the outbreak of the Second World War. All social, political, and cultural life became subject to the party and the security agency. Centralism, Stakhanovite norms, and collectivization are in fact means of subjugating the economy to military goals. The Polish People's Army, like any army of a country conquered by the Soviets, was not, in fact, a sovereign army, which, for instance, had its own mobilization plans or its own military doctrine. No such thing ever existed in the history of the People's Republic of Poland. It was simply part of the Soviet Empire. So the dominant attitude was that we need to stock up on arms and train our soldiers quickly, because tomorrow we may just as well be stationed in Paris or in Washington. The Red Army's war plans required the complete pacification of the interior behind the prospective European front line of World War III. Meanwhile, on the territories of Poland and the newly annexed Western Soviet republics, anti-communist organizations and guerrilla units were still operating. To destroy them completely, the Soviets and their collaborators employed the well-tested mechanisms of provocation. The mechanism depended on the creation of a fictitious organization, fully managed by secret police officers and agents. The communists managed to persuade Stefan Schenker, one of the key figures in the 4th Directorate of the Freedom and Independence Association, to cooperate. As a result, they could create the Fifth Directorate, which was 100% fake, made up exclusively of secret police agents or officers. The organization also absorbed genuine freedom fighters who were convinced that they were joining a real resistance movement. On the one hand, the aim was to stamp out the remnants of the Polish underground state and its émigré activists. On the other, to undermine the very idea of resisting the empire in such ways. The goal was to identify potential circles predisposed to anti-communist resistance. The most important of these operations was the deception game played with Huzar, commander of a large guerrilla unit operating in the Białystok region, one that proved successful for the communists. After 4 years eluding his pursuers, Kamieński finally trusted the secret police agents planted among his partisans over those 4 years. He was captured together with his closest associates, sentenced to death and murdered. We know that this operational game was the model script for all such deception operations, namely Operation Trust. In the days of the People's Republic of Poland, whole generations of secret police officers were trained to emulate the successful operation against freedom and independence, regarded as a classic example of how to conduct operational games. From the international perspective, the operational game's primary goal was deception. Schenkel makes the game look real enough to the foreign delegation, which, completely unaware of the situation, confirms the Fifth Directorate's credibility before British and American intelligence agencies. The aim of the deception is to make the Americans and British believe that in post-Yalta Poland, a strong underground organization exists, which in the event of a Third World War is capable of carrying out effective sabotage actions behind Soviet lines. These assumptions were intended to create a false impression and encourage a miscalculation of the strength and resources required to stabilize the fronts in Western Europe or to win there. From September 1949, Stalin had his own nuclear weapons. In October, his ally Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China, and a year later, he sent 1 million so-called volunteers to war in Korea, where the United States was trying to stop the advance of communism. Going to war in Korea, Stalin knew what the possible outcome might be, and he was more than willing to take the risk. He was not afraid. Stalin and Mao Zedong had joint plans for 1949, 1950 and 1952, plans for World War III, which they intended to implement. Stalin's message to Mao in October 1950. Obviously, I also take into account the possibility that the USA, despite their lack of readiness for a large-scale war, might want to go to war for reasons of prestige. Should we fear such a development? I think not. Acting together, we will be stronger than the United States and Britain combined, while the remaining capitalist states do not pose a serious military threat. If war is unavoidable, we had better start it now rather than in a few years. Enough materials have been published recently to give us a good idea of what was being prepared. For example, we know of Stalin's order to start forming 100 new bomber squadrons equipped with Ilyushin-28 medium bombers. 100 squadrons, that's 10,000 Ilyushin-28s alone. Stalin also ordered that 1,200 new submarines be produced. These are not typical peacetime orders. Simultaneously, he planned a purge of the entire high command. He was preparing the same kind of terror before World War III as the one employed before the Second World War. This was no coincidence. He had to wind up and oil the machine again before starting the Third World War. The key theme underlying the new wave of terror was to be a campaign of anti-Semitism. At the time, the emergence of the State of Israel on the map of the world made the support for the Soviet state among the Jewish diaspora less unanimous than it had been during the Second World War. In the early days of 1953, Stalin set the propaganda machine in motion. The public was bombarded by state-run mass media with news unmasking an alleged conspiracy of prominent Kremlin physicians, the Doctor's Plot, aimed at assassinating the top Soviet leaders as part of an anti-Soviet conspiracy devised by international Jewry and Western intelligence agencies. Stalin's accusation against the Ministry of State Security for a lack of vigilance is a clear indicator that the purge was going to affect the top leadership as well. Soon arrests and mass deportations begin. They were interrupted by Stalin's death. Stalin's works will live forever in the grateful memory of the generations to come. When he died, his comrades began to wonder how to handle the succession. The first to come up with a proposal of reforms was Beria. Beria, a red butcher just like Dzerzhinsky, was in fact the author of the perestroika concept of introducing some reforms and allowing for a relative liberalization for a period. Obviously not in order to wreck the empire, but in order to strengthen it. Beria suggested that firstly the center of power be transferred from the Politburo and the party to the state administration. A second issue, a very important one, was the liberation of the economic elite, which meant that the whole realm of ideology was to be marginalized. Thirdly, which was absolutely crucial for perestroika, Beria wanted to support the development of a national elite. Beria also predicted the reunification of Germany, of course, but he wanted to see the united Germany neutralized. Moreover, Beria planned to strike a deal with the émigré opposition, which is also a major contribution to perestroika thinking, because from then on, what was the security apparatus supposed to focus on? Its main focus, in Beria's view, was to be shifted from an intensive internal operational presence to intelligence. To what end? The major target for intelligence was Western technology. Communism is not able to develop and progress. It can only steal. Because he was simultaneously collecting evidence against his Politburo comrades, he became too dangerous, and his colleagues decided to remove him. There are differing versions of what really happened. A special unit, we don't know exactly whether it was the military or the security apparatus, arrested Beria or perhaps killed him on the spot. We don't know for sure, as there are different versions of this event. In the most vivid version, Beria is jointly strangled by his comrades during a session of the Politburo. Beria is another, but by no means the last, chief of Soviet secret police who doesn't die of natural causes. The ending of Beria's perestroika, the bloody suppression of rebellions in various Gulag camps by the Red Army, and the Berlin intervention in the summer of 1953 would from now on constitute permanent elements in the repertoire of power struggles in the communist-controlled states. It wasn't only Beria who had blood on his hands, since there was a collective responsibility for what is commonly referred to as the Stalinist phase. So with Stalin gone, there they are, sitting together and thinking, what do we do next? What's to be done? We should be extending our influence across the globe, but how do we go about that? Previously, there was no atom bomb. Now the bomb is stopping us. Previously, Europe was divided. The British would fight the Germans would fight the Poles. It was a war, everyone against everyone. There were opportunities. Now they're all united in NATO. Previously, America was on our side, now it's our enemy. What's to be done? The involvement of the United States in Europe was the key here, because America was the only world power capable of stopping the Soviets. The Soviets simply understood that they could not afford to embark on World War III. They didn't have enough manpower, technical means or resources. And the GRU produced a report that was referred to as the Locomotive Report. Its thesis was that capitalism is like a giant railway engine, and this railway engine cannot be destroyed. But it is possible to locate a small part, such as a small screw that can be removed, thus bringing the locomotive to a halt. And then we spread across the globe. The small screw was oil. Immediately after Stalin's death, the Soviets tried to infiltrate Egypt. The issue is the Suez Canal and oil deliveries from the Near East. And an international crisis follows. And then Algeria, Egypt, Syria, and the conflicts begin to multiply, one after the other. Wars, wars, wars. Because the Soviet reach could extend so far. If only we had direct access to the Mediterranean, but Turkey was an obstacle. Stalin had tried to overrun Turkey. NATO was created to protect Greece and Turkey from Stalin. That was its original purpose. And nothing works. Nothing at all works. And there's a long road ahead of us. There's Afghanistan. Afghanistan and Pakistan are only stopovers on our way to the sea. So, in 1954, when the GRU came up with this locomotive report about unscrewing a small screw, the Soviet Union started road construction works in Afghanistan, digging tunnels along the north-south axis. Afghanistan was the Soviet Union's last hope. From 1954 to 1979, they dug those tunnels and they built those roads. And the Afghans were asking, how much will it cost? And our reply was, don't worry about that, you'll pay later. You'll pay later.